Hello. I make games, you play games, I'm a here, and today we're reading classics. Specifically, we've gotten up to chapter 5 of Miss Marjoribanks. As usual, a couple of notes before we start. There is a fly in my room at the moment, and I've tried to coax it out several times, but it has done no good whatsoever, and it's one of those energetic kind where I can't actually just squash it, no matter how much I try. So if I ever get distracted, let's blame it on the fly. Hmm. The other part is that there's a schedule of power cuts going through my area. I think it's about done, but nonetheless, it can't be too safe. So if it ever pauses or cuts through, it's likely because either mine or your internet has briefly gone out. The internet likely doesn't stay off when the power cut goes on, but it does stay off for like a couple of minutes it takes for the generator to turn back on. Um, just like about that. And last I think that's about all of our notes so far. We can now return back to Marjoribanks. Last that we were reading, Marjoribanks has turned about 19 years old, and she has just returned back to her town to begin her reign as the leader that she is, or that she will become over the course of this book. So I'm excited for the next chapter. Let's start into it. Miss Marjoribanks did not leave the contralto any time to recover from her surprise. She went up to her direct where she stood, with her song arrested on her lips, as she had risen hastily from the piano. "Is it Rose?" said Lucilla, going forward with the most eager cordiality, and holding out both her hands, though to be sure she knew very well it was not Rose, who was about half the height of the singer, and was known to everybody in Mount Pleasant to be utterly innocent of a voice. "No," said Miss Lake, who was much astonished and startled and offended, as was unfortunately rather her custom. She was a young woman without any of those instincts of politeness which make some people pleasant in spite of themselves, and she added nothing to soften this abrupt negative, but drew her hands away from the stranger and stood bolt upright, looking at her with a burning blush caused by the temper much more than by embarrassment on her face. "Then," said Lucilla, dropping lightly into the most comfortable chair she could get sight of in the bare little parlour, "it is Barbara, and that is a great deal better. Rose is a good little thing, but she's different, you know. It is so odd you should not remember me. I thought everybody knew me in Clangford. You know, I have been a long time away, and I now have come to home for good. Your voice is just so the very thing to go with mine. Was it now? Was it not a lucky thing that I should have passed just at the right moment? I don't know how it is, but somehow these lucky chances always happen to me. I'm Lucilla Marjoribanks, you know? Indeed. I'm not quite certain of what voice to give Barbara, because it will end up that I'll mess up and find that, in fact, she's maybe 40-year-old and I had never known. And then I have to adjust it. Indeed, said Barbara, who had not the least intention of being civil. I did not recognize you in the least. Yes, I remember. You were always short-sighted a little, said Miss Marjoribanks calmly. I should so like if we could try a duet. I have been having lessons in Italy, you know, and I am sure I could give you a few hints. I always like, when I can, to be of use. Tell me what songs you have that we could sing together. You know, my dear, it is not as if I was asking you for mere amusement to myself. My grand object in life is to be a comfort to Papa. Do you mean Dr. Marjoribanks? Said the uncivil Barbara. I'm sure he does not care in the least for music. I think you must be making a mistake. Oh no, said Lucilla. I've never made mistakes. I don't mean to sing to woo him, you know, but you are just the very person I wanted. As for the ridiculous idea some people have that nobody can be called on who does not live in Grange Lane, I assure you I mean to make an end of that. Of course, I cannot commence just all in a moment, but it would always be an advantage to practice a little together. I like to know exactly how far one can calculate upon everybody. Then one can tell, without fear of breaking down, just what one may venture to do. I don't understand in the least, said Barbara, whose pride was up in arms. Perhaps you think I'm a professional singer? My dear, Professional singers spoil everything, said Miss Marjoribanks. It changes the character of an evening altogether. There are so few people who understand that. When you have professional singers, you have to give yourself up to music, and that is not my view in the least. My great aim, as all my friends are aware, is to be a comfort to dear papa. I wish you would not talk in riddles, said Lucilla's amazed and indignant companion in her round, rich contralto. I don't know what the contralto is as far as voices go, so alas. I suppose you are Miss Marjoribanks? I have always heard that Miss Marjoribanks was a little. There, said Lucilla triumphantly. Really, it is almost like a recitatio. Recitatio, yeah. To hear you speak, I'm so glad. I'll add a bit more tone to the voice of her companion here, from here on out. What have you got there? Oh, to be sure, it's that duet out of Trovatore. Do let us try it. There is nobody here, and everything is so convenient. And it would never do to risk a breakdown. Will you play the accompaniment, or shall I? Said Miss Marjoribanks, taking off her gloves. As for the drawing master's daughter, she stood aghast, lost in such a sudden bewilderment and perplexity that she could not find no words to reply. It's very funny the way that Marjoribanks as a character is so domineering of a persona, and she just doesn't break down no matter how many times she displeases someone. And I think that's really a lesson in almost like rejection, like therapy of it. And I find it really cool, you know? She thought she could be helpful, and she kind of dug through it in a not the worst manner you could possibly do it, I suppose, because it was still with words. But I also find it really funny the way that they almost at each other's throats when they're discussing, which makes a lot of sense. But I really, really enjoy the subtle way in which it is. I think a lot of the time, modern fantasy tries to emulate this sort of thing with their talking between characters, but maybe it's because a lot of it I find that I read is translated from other languages. There's no nuance like there is here in this old British literature, so that is really cool. Mm. Now, where were we? Mm-mm-mm. She was not in the least amiable or yielding by nature, but Lucilla took it so much as a matter of course that Barbara could not find a word to say, and before she could be sure that it was real, Miss Marjoribanks had seated herself at the piano. Barbara was so obstinate that she would not sing the first part, which ought to have been hers, but she was not clever enough for her antagonist. Lucilla sang her part by herself gallantly, and when it came to Barbara's turn the second time, Miss Marjoribanks essayed the second in a false voice, which drove the contralto off her guard. And then the magnificent volume of sound flowed forth grand enough to have filled Lucilla with envy if she had not been sustained by the sublime confidence in herself which is the first necessity to a woman with a mission. She paused a moment in the accompaniment to clap her hands after that strophe was accomplished, and then resumed with energy. And that's nice because it's in a way an encouragement, but also it's just like a good reaction to have. For, to be sure, she knew by instinct what sort of clay that people were made of by whom she had to work. Yes, see how I said earlier that it's a good encouragement? So here it says that because she knows by instinct what kind of people are, like, when she talks to them, what kind of a person someone is, that encouragement is why she's used it, because she could tell that that's the kind of encouragement she could use in order to become on friendly terms, I suppose. That's like the thing that she needed to continue, and that's cool. And gave them their reward with the liberty and discrimination, which is the glory of enlightened despotism. Despotism. Oh, I love that. Which is the glory of enlightened despotism. To call somebody a despot obviously means that they're controlling and evil, or such a thing. And enlightened despotism would, in this case, mean somebody that is mm, smart and manipulative in their controlling nature, I guess, a sort of thing. Like, she's enlightened to the ways, when someone's knowledgeable of a thing, enlightened to a thing, you know? It's not quite the exact same words, but I don't have any other words to explain them in because, as with most synonyms, they don't mean the exact same thing, just similar. So yeah, But yeah, it's quite great. It is quite common with enlightened despotism, I suppose, to do that kind of people reading and then using it, I suppose. But yeah, quite great. I like that Miss Marjoribanks is not written like a lot of the time you hear characters written nowadays with the idea of, oh, a character should be good, but then they should also have personality flaws. Whereas in this one feels like they wrote a personality flaw and then wrote the goodness around that personality flaw, which I really appreciate and I think is kind of cool because it makes her unique first and foremost. It really fleshes that out. Um, and secondly, it makes for a really interesting story where even in such a boring setting as essentially this is like middle-aged suburbia essentially, where it's like, oh, here's all the upper middle class and upper class society just in living on a lane together. Upper middle class, I think, is probably the closest they're getting. They're still working society, but they're not royalty, right? But they are quite rich enough to afford servants, so upper middle class for that time. Mm. And so it's great, the book. You know, it makes a setting that would have otherwise been very boring because there's no stakes, there's nothing that exciting, into a very interesting setting because of the ways that it's centered around it. It's almost as if her own flaw is the like central point of the story, and it makes a really character-driven story, which I really love. Mm. Miss Marjoribanks was naturally elated when she had performed this important and successful tour. She got up from the piano and closed it in her open, imperial way. "I do not want to tire you, she said. "That will do for today. I told you your voice was the very thing to go with mine. Give my love to Rose when she comes in, but don't bring her with you when you come to me. She's a good little thing, but then she is different, you know?" said the bland Lucilla, and she held out her hand to her captive graciously, and gathered up her parasol. Captive and captive audience thus far, which is grand, because that is exactly what is happening. Which she had left on her chair. Barbara Lake let her visitor go for after this, with a sense that she had fallen asleep and had dreamt it all. But after all, there was something in the visit which was not disagreeable when she came to think it over. The drawing master was poor, and he had a quantity of children, as was natural, and Barbara had never forgiven her mother for dying just at the moment when she had a chance of seeing a little of what she called the world. At the time, Mr. Lake and his portfolio of drawings were asked out frequently to tea, and when he had pupils in the family, some kind people asked him to bring one of his daughters with him, so that Barbara, who was ambitious, had beheld herself for a moment or two almost on the threshold of Grange Lane. And it was at this moment, of all others, just at the same time as Miss Marjoribanks finished her pale career, that poor Miss Lake thought fit to die, to the injury of her daughter's prospects and the destruction of her hopes. And like, because, okay, we all know that this book is written by a woman, right? But I really like the different ways women are treated and written here. I love that they have ambitions and they have skills and they have complex dynamics with each other, so they're not just black and white. I really, really do. Mm. Naturally, Barbara had never quite forgiven that injury. It was this sense of having been ill used which made her so resolute about sending Rose to Mount Pleasant, though the poor little girl did not in the least want to go, and was very happy helping her papa at the School of Design. But Barbara saw no reason why Rose should be happy, while she herself had to resign her inclinations and look after a set of odious children. To be sure, it was a little hard upon a young woman of proper ambition, who knew she was handsome, to fall back into the housekeeping and consent to remain unseen and unheard, for Barbara was also aware that she had a remarkable voice. In these circumstances, it may be imagined that after the first movement of the passionate temper was over, when she had taken breath and had time to consider this sudden and extraordinary visit, a glimmer of hope and interest penetrated into the bosom of the gloomy girl. So essentially she was an older sister and she had some like ambitions of her own about moving away, seeing the world, whether that be through courting like a husband or finding somebody else. And many of them visited her father, who was a known artisan, until her mother died, and that kind of stopped, put an end to that. And Rose has no musical talent, but she was very skilled at drawing and some embroidery, which she found out earlier when discussing Marjoribanks' time at her boarding school, and who got her the position and everything else. But her older sister sent her off there because she grew bitter in having to look after the younger siblings when she herself wanted to have a life of her own that was suddenly, she felt, robbed of her, you know? Which is honestly a realistic thing. It's still, it's not even exclusive to that time. And I kind of appreciate that kind of representation in the way that they interact with each other as a result of that. I really like, I don't want to say it's like a woman-led narrative or anything, because honestly, where are the men? But like, you know, it's it's nice to see characters interact and have it complex, but also with note to either realistic circumstance or even with note to their gender in a way that is, mm, I'd say, more respectful of it. It's not treated as an object or a side thought or even a reason. It's treated as a side along, a natural, not conclusion, but more a natural prelude to what the characters will be going on through. Um, so it still plays a role, but not the same that you would see in maybe more modern feminist literature. So that's something I find an interesting point of difference between the two. I will not say which one's which because I know that both stances on women writing have had their uses in feminism over the years, right? Um, some like there's different reasons why feminism old and then how it changed over time, and those uses are accurate to the time period and they're all needed. So there's that. But I did want to point out the differences that I think I find because I find them quite interesting. Now, where were we once more? Hmm. Right, let me scroll up. There we go. She was 2 years older than Miss Marjoribanks, and as different in style as she was in her voice. She was not stout as yet, though it is the nature of a contralto to be stout. But she was tall, with all due opportunity for the development which might come later. And then Barbara possessed a kind of beauty, the beauty of a passionate and somewhat sullen brunette, dark and glowing, with straight black eyebrows, and very dark and very straight, which gave, oddly enough, a suggestion of oblique vision in her eyes. But her eyes were not in the least oblique, and looked at you straight from under the black line of shadow with no doubtful expression. She was shy in a kind of way as was natural to a young woman who had never seen any society and felt herself, on the whole, injured and unappreciated. But no two things could be more different than this shyness which made Barbara look you straight in the face with a kind of scared defiance, and a sweet shyness that pleaded for kind treatment in the soft eyes of little Rose, who was plain and had the oddest longing to make people comfortable, and please them in her way, which, to be sure, was not always successful. Barbara sat down on the stool before the piano, which Miss Marjoribanks had been obliging us to close, and thought it all over with growing excitement. No doubt it was a little puzzling to make out how the discovery of a fine contralto and the possibility of getting up unlimited duets could further Lucilla in the great aim of her life, which was to be comfort to her dear papa. But it's here that before we go on to the next part, I wanted to also maybe say a little bit about the two girls in the families we have met so far, Barbara and Rose. So Barbara is obviously an older sister, and we have gotten quite a bit of her character here. I don't think I need to explain again. But I find the contrast to Rose, while also a good literary device, right? To be also kind of realistic and interesting of the family dynamic. Because Rose is, from what we can so far presume, the youngest. And it's not uncommon for the youngest to take on these kind of people-pleasing tendencies when with an older sister who is probably more strict on the A card, and B, because siblings get overlooked a lot, so they don't feel like they have a choice of like attention, and therefore they want to get more of the positive attention sometimes, um, which is can lead to unhealthy habits such as people pleasing when it is unhealthy. And here we have an example of where Rose is always aiming to please and comfort people around her, but she's not always successful. Now, whether that is something Rose does out of the goodness of her heart and understanding, or whether it's something that she does because she feels like any other way she won't receive positive attention, is a whole other question. Well, it's not one currently addressed here. Still, I find it interesting and a touch realistic. Hmm. But Barbara, right? But Barbara was like a soldier of fortune and ready to take a great deal for granted, and swallow much that was mysterious in the program of the adventurous general who might lead her on to glory. So in this case, the adventurous general is obviously Lucilla, also known as Miss Marjoribanks, and she herself is here shown as a soldier, which we have. I really like it because it is the archetype that she portrays, right? When someone needs to pick up the responsibility of something and do what is good, she will do so. And when, you know, even if it comes at a cost of her position and power or a cost of like her freedom, because that's the cost that she's been paying by looking after the children here, but at least that's what she feels like. So, yeah. In half an hour, her dreams had gone so far that she saw herself receiving in Miss Marjoribanks' drawing room the homage, not only of Grange Lane, but even of the country families who would be attracted by rumors of her wonderful performance. And Barbara was, to her own consciousness, walking up the middle aisle of Clarendon Church in a veil of real Brussels before little Mr. Lake came in, hungry and good-tempered from his round. To be sure, she had not concluded who was to be bridegroom, but that was one of the matters of detail which could not be precisely concluded on till the time. So she did want a marriage, and that's something that she felt robbed of when she had to be hidden away, not like literally, but in the way of if you're working at home all the time, you don't go outside very much. You don't have the freedom for it. So that's quite interesting and cool. I'll take a sip of tea before I lose it. Mm. Now, mm, let me check on a couple things. It works. Great. Such was the immediate result, so far as the secondary personage was concerned, of Lucilla's masterly impromptu, and it is needless to say that the accomplished warrior, who had her wits always about her, and had made, while engaged in a simple reconnaissance, so brilliant and successful a capture, withdrew from the scene, still more entirely satisfied with herself. Hello! It's lovely to see you here again. We're currently reading classical literature. This is Miss Marjoribanks. She's also referred in writing here as Lucilla. It's a wonderful piece written by a woman quite a long time ago. I think at least 100 years. I think it was in the 1800s. So there's that. So far, Miss Marjoribanks is taking over her upper and middle class suburban neighborhood of the time, and it's going pretty well. Oh, also, I have gotten tea. We are currently reading it and discussing it, so at any point, feel free to chime in and such things. Hopefully, you enjoyed. She has just finished talking to a Miss Barbara, who is a woman about 2 years older than her, who sings really, really well because she comes from a family of artists, and so it mentions her here a couple times. Nothing indeed could have come more opportunely for Lucilla, who possessed in perfection that faculty of throwing herself into the future and anticipating the difficulties of a position which is so valuable to all who aspire to be leaders of mankind. With a prudence which Dr. Marjoribanks himself would have acknowledged to be remarkable in a person of her age and sex, Lucilla had already foreseen that to amuse her guests entirely in her own person would be at once impracticable and bad style. Hmm. I'll be listening to and drawing at the same time. That's wonderful, yeah. Very good. Very good plan. Mm. But yeah, Lucilla is currently getting a she's kind of preparing for her takeover of this place, although preparing would be probably a bad word for how active a stance she's taking with it. Mm. But part of it involves gathering up the local high society of it, and by high I do mean local. Because it's local, this is the highest it gets. They're all working families, but they're the rich kind of working families, upper middle class of the time, that have like servants of their own at times, or other things like that, as opposed to lower and I guess lower class, and those are the people who work as maids and such. Mm. But they're not quite upper class enough to be aristocracy, for example. Mm. With a prudence which Dr. Marjoribanks himself, that's her father, would have acknowledged to be remarkable. Ah, we already went past that part. Wonderful. The first objection might have been got over, for Miss Marjoribanks had a soul above the ordinary limits of possibility, but the second unanswerable. This discovery, however, satisfied all the necessities of the position. Lucilla, who was liberal, as genius ought always to be, was perfectly willing that all the young ladies in Claringford should sing their little songs while she was entertaining her guests. And then, at the right moment, when her ruling mind saw it was necessary, would occur the duet, the one duet which should be the great feature of the evening. Thus, it will be seen that another quality of the highest order developed itself during Miss Marjoribanks' deliberations. For, to tell the truth, she set a good deal of store by her voice, and had been used to applause, and had tasted the sweetness of individual success. This, however, was willing to sacrifice for the enhanced and magnificent effect which she felt could be produced by the combination of the two voices. So, when she was away on her trip to Europe and overseas, she had practiced. I think she said that she learned to sing in France, and so she was quite used to applause and other things like that and being exceptional, but she was willing to sacrifice that for the combination of the two voices. And the sacrifice was one which a weaker woman would have been incapable of making. So, and sharing an audience and a lot of other things, I think. Because we know her to be. She's often described as a despot here, right? But we see her acting in a way where she's sharing for her greater goals, I suppose. At least that's what the writing makes it sound like. She went home past Salem Chapel by the little lane which makes a line of communication between the end of Grove Street and the beginning of Grange Lane, with a sentiment of satisfaction worthy the greatness of her mission. Dr. Marjoribanks never came home to lunch, and indeed had a contempt for the feminine indulgence, which, to be sure, might be accounted for by the fact that about the time in the day the doctor very often found himself to be passing close by one or the other of the houses in the neighbourhood which had a reputation for a good sherry or Madeira, such as exists no more. So, a very, very good one that you can't find anywhere else. Lucilla, accordingly, had her lunch alone, served to her with respectful care by Nancy, who was still under the impression of the interview of the morning, and it occurred to Miss Marjoribanks, as she sat at the table alone, that this was an opportunity too valuable to be left unimproved. For, to be sure, there are few things more pleasant than a little impromptu luncheon party, where everybody comes without being expected, fresh from the outside world, and ready to tell all that is going on. Though, on the other hand, it was a little doubtful now it might work on Claringford, where the men had generally something to do, and where the married ladies took the luncheon when the children had their dinner, and presided at the nursery meal. And as for the party of young ladies, even supposing they had the courage to come, with no more solid Admixture. Yeah, it was admixture. Huh. With no more solid admixture of the more important members of society, Lucilla, to tell the truth, had no particular taste for that. Miss Marjoribanks reflected as she ate, and indeed, thanks to her perfect health and her agreeable morning walk, Lucilla had a very pretty appetite, and enjoyed her meal in a way that would have been most satisfactory to her many friends. That it must be by way of making his visit, which was aggravating under all circumstances, more aggravating still that Tom Marjoribanks had decided to come now, of all times in the world. If he had waited till things were organized, he might have been a little use, Lucilla said to herself, for at least he could have bought some of the men that come on circuit, and that would have made a little novelty, but of course, just now, it would never do to make a rush at people and invite them all at once. After a moment's consideration, however, Miss Marjoribanks, with her usual candor, reflected that it was not in Tom Marjoribanks' power to change the time of Carlingford Assizes, and that, accordingly, he was not to be blamed in the particular at least. Of course, it is not his fault, she added to herself, but it is astonishing how things have with some men always at the wrong moment. And it is so like Tom. These reflections were interrupted by the arrival of visitors, whom Miss Marjoribanks received with her usual grace. The first was old Miss Shelley, who kissed Lucilla, and wanted to know how she had enjoyed herself at the Continent, and if she had brought many pretty things home. "My dear, you have grown ever so much since the last time I saw you," the old lady said in her grandmotherly way. "And stout with it, which is such a comfort with a tall girl. And then your poor dear mamma was so delicate. I have always been a little anxious about you on that account, Lucilla, and I'm so glad, my dear, to see you looking so strong." "Dear Miss Chilly," said Miss Marjoribanks, who perhaps in her heart was not quite so gratified by this compliment as the old lady intended, "the great aim of my life is to be comfort to dear papa." Miss Chilly was very much moved by this filial piety, and she told Lucilla this story about the colonel's niece, Susan, who was such a good daughter and had refused three excellent offers to devote herself to her father and mother, with which the public in Grange Lane were tolerably acquainted. "And one of them was a baronet, my dear," said Miss Shelley. Miss Marjoribanks did not make any decided response, for she felt that it would be dangerous to commit herself to such a height of abnegation as that. But the old lady was quite pleased to hear her travels and adventures instead, and stayed so long that Miss Centum and Miss Woodburn, who happened to arrive at the same moment, found her still there. Ah, so a party is coming along, like a tea party. Oh, that's wonderful. I'm so happy for her. I love the way that works out, you know? Ah, it's so good to see her improve as a conversationalist. Mm-mm. Especially just like in the previous thing we have discussed, the previous part of this, we have discussed that Miss Marjoribanks and her father are both autistic, but in very much the ways that is stereotypical of their gender. And Miss Marjoribanks practices scripting, which is to say, she will memorize and act out things like small talk and conversation in order to improve it. And the other part of it is that Miss Marjoribanks is dauntless and will not give up on getting better at conversation, no matter how discouraged she might be. Not herself, but in the way of other people discouraging her specifically. And in doing so, you can really see her progress here from when she first came through, when she was young and her mother has first died. And so that's, I'm very proud for her, you know? It's neat. Because you can see it come to fruition here, where she's a good enough conversationalist where she won't, even if she doesn't have like anything to say about the topic, she'll have other ways to continue the conversation, and she'll do so long enough to where she can bring about people around her and hold court, as a matter of fact. Now, where were we? Miss Shelley was a little afraid of Miss Woodburn, and she took her leave hastily with another kiss, and Lucilla found herself face to face with the only two women who could attempt a rival enterprise to her own in Carlingford. As for Miss Woodburn, she had settled herself in an easy chair by the fire and was fully prepared to take notes. So, again, a little bit of a background for our new viewer is these two were described in the last chapter about who could have started a proper society in Claringford. Miss Woodburn being a woman who didn't do so because she was known to be mean. You know, the kind of person that is sits out in a lawn and judges everyone, which makes her entertaining enough in these circumstances where nothing happens, but not well enough to start a society where you have to at least try to be a little pleasant. To be sure, Lucilla was the very person to fall victim to her arts, for that confidence in herself which, in one point of view, gave grandeur to the Chancellor of Miss Marjoribanks, gave her also a certain naivety and openness which the most simple rustic could not have surpassed. Hmm. I'm sure by her face she has been telling you about my niece Susan. Ah, I suppose it was a different voice. Oh, there's so many voices to do for them. Hmm. I'm probably going to end up repeating quite a few because it's already a lot. I don't think I can give it like an accent or anything. I don't even know accents. Hmm. Maybe if I slow it down? No, but she's more of a brash woman in that regard. Or quick, I suppose, to be that judgmental. Hmm. Hmm. I'm sure by her face she had been telling you about my niece Susan, said the mimic, assuming Miss Chilly's tone and almost her appearance for the moment. And that one of them was a baronet, my dear. I always know from her look what she has been saying. The colonel was much as usual, but suffering a little from the cold, as he always does in this climate. She must be a good soul, for she always has her favourite little speeches written on her face. I'm sure I don't know, said Miss Marjoribanks, who felt it was her duty to make an example. There has always been one thing remarkable with me all my life, that I never have had a great sense of humour. I know it's singular, but when one has a defect, it is always so much better to confess it. I always get on very well with anything else, but I never had any sense of humour, you know, and I'm very fond of Miss Shelley. Has always had a fancy for me from the time I was born, and she has such a nice manners. But then it is so odd I should have no sense of humour, said Lucilla, addressing herself to Miss Centrum, who was sitting in her sofa by her. Don't you think it is very odd? Oh, this is another great time to point out the autism. So, we've talked previously about how she doesn't have a very good relationship with social cues, and there's two things that are going on here. First is that the mean-spirited Miss Woodburn is making a deprecating joke at Miss Chilly's expense over here, and Lucilla, Miss Marjoribanks, points out that she doesn't understand jokes, and partially the part about autism here is that that is also another common thing with it is having difficulty with sarcasm and similar things. Um, but in communicating that she doesn't understand jokes, she, in addition, also communicates that she will not tolerate jokes at Miss Chilly's expense because she's quite fond of her. And so that is neat. Oh, I don't know what voice to give Miss Santa. Hmm. I'm sure it is very nice, said Miss Centum. I hate people that laugh at everything. I don't see much to laugh at myself, I'm sure. In a distracting world, anyone who has a lot of children and servants like me to look after finds very little to laugh at. And she seizes the opportunity to enter upon the domestic circumstances. Miss Woodburn did not answer a word. She made a most dashing, murderous sketch of Lucilla, but did the future ruler of Clarendon very little harm. And then, by the evening, it was known through all Grange Lane that Miss Marjoribanks had snubbed the caricaturist who kept all the good people in terror of their lives, snubbed her absolutely, and took the words out of her very mouth, was the report that flew through Grange Lane. And it may be imagined how Lucilla's prestige rose in consequence, and how much people began to expect of Miss Marjoribanks, who had performed such a feat almost on the first day of her return home. Yeah, that's great. She did this so very effectively. Mm-mm. If anyone ever has trouble following along, because I know it's old literature, and so all of the terms are either not used commonly or are just not a thing nowadays, was, you know, very, very seldom used words. Although, in using seldom, I'm probably proving my point. I learned initially English through reading old literature and like books in Old English, so as such, I tend to use a lot of these words that are not common nowadays outside of either scientific essays and similar things of the sort, or particularly well done ChatGPT, I suppose, which is quite sad. But so we must move on to chapter 6. Oh god, not Tom. I don't want to see Tom. Oh, Tom is her cousin who has almost represented her last time she met him, which means we all hate Tom, including Miss Marjoribanks, rightfully so. But perhaps he'll, I don't know, change our perspectives by becoming a better person. Who knows? Nonetheless, she's not really a reliable narrator anyway, so we'll see. Tom Marjoribanks arrived that night, according to the doctor's expectation. He arrived with that curious want of adaptation to the circumstances which characterized the young man at an hour which put Nancy entirely out, and upset the equanimity of the kitchen for 24 hours at least. He came, if anyone can convince of such an instance of carelessness, by the 9 o'clock train, just as they had finished putting to rights downstairs. Oh, see, I still don't like Tom. I still don't. What do you mean you came by 9 o'clock train? So it's already 9 p.m. Let's hope by the time he gets there. But at this point, it's looking more like by the time he leaves, which is not particularly amazing to begin with. So it's late at night, the kitchen's closed, and he comes in, and so obviously I have to cook for him right after they're done packing up for the day. Oh, now where were we? Right. After this, Miss Marjoribanks' conclusion that the fact of the Clallingford's essays occurring a day or two after her arrival, when as yet she was not fully prepared to take advantage of them, was so like Tom, may be partially understood. And of course, he was furiously hungry and could have managed perfectly to be in time for dinner if he had not missed the train at the Dickton Junction by some wonderful blunder of the railway people, which never could have occurred but for his unlucky presence among the passengers. Lucilla took Thomas apart and sent him downstairs with the most conciliatory message. Tell Nancy not to put herself about, but to send up something cold, the cold pie or anything she can find handy. Tell her I am so vexed, but it is just like Mr. Tom, and he never knows what he is eating, said Miss Marjoribanks. So essentially, you came so late, you're deserving of a cold dinner, which is valid. Nancy cooks and cleans all day. You don't want to be cooking after your shift. And it's already late enough as is. As for Nancy, this sweetness did not subdue her in the least. She said, I'll thank Miss Lucilla to mind her own business. The cold pie is for master's breakfast. I ain't such a goose as not to know what to send upstairs, and that Thomas can tell her if he likes. Hmm. Mm-hmm. Maybe it's spelled with the sound? I'm not quite certain. English is always a bit of a weird language to read, but it's great. So she tried to be accommodating to Nancy, right? And then Nancy, who feels like she's trying to tell her how to do her job, tells her back to send a message of she will do as she likes and she will do her damn job if she pleases. Because Nancy does take the quality of her cooking very seriously, which we found a little bit earlier. In the meantime, the doctor was in the drawing room, much against his will, with the two young people spinning about the room and looking at Lucilla's books and knickknacks on the tables by the way of covering his impatience. He wanted to carry off Tom, who was rather a favorite, to his own den downstairs, where the young man's supper was to be served. But at the same time, Dr. Marjoribanks could not deny that Lucilla had a right to the greetings and homage of her cousin. He could not help thinking, on the whole, as he looked at the two, what a much more sensible arrangement it would have been if he had had the boy instead of his sister, who had been a widow for ever so long, and no doubt had spoiled her son, as women always do. And then Lucilla might have passed under the sway of Miss Marjoribanks, with no doubt, who no doubt would have known how to manage her. Oh, okay, that's interesting. So, like, he reads that he likes Tom. I guess they share a special interest or something, because I wished reading this and I have no idea what there is to like about Tom, but clearly they have a lot to discuss. And he does mourn the fact that maybe he couldn't be his son a little bit, because then they could talk about more things in common that he doesn't feel he can talk about with Marjoribanks. But that same father had sent Marjoribanks away for quite some time, so no wonder you don't. That and, good old-fashioned sexism of the time, I suppose. That being said, Miss Marjoribanks and Doctor do get along on the same wavelengths at least, and that's quite nice. Even if she likes to pretend otherwise and not really care about his wishes in the same way that he doesn't really care for hers, as we have showcased here. So, thus the Doctor mused that with that sense of mild amazement of the blunders of Providence, which so many people experience, and without any idea that Miss Marjoribanks would have found the task a great deal beyond her powers in the management of Lucilla. As for Tom, he was horribly hungry, having found, as was to be expected, no possible means of lunching at Didcot. Oh, of lunching at Didcot, but at the same time he was exhilarated by Lucilla's smile and delighted to think of having a week at least to spend in her society. What voice shall we give Tom? I don't think I ever. No, wrong. I don't think I ever saw you looking so well, he was saying, and you know my opinion generally on the subject. To which Lucilla responded in a way to wither all the germs of sentiment in the bud. What subject? She said. My looks? I'm sure they can't be interesting to you. You're as hungry as ever you can be, and I can see in your eyes. Papa, he is famishing, and I don't think he can contain himself any longer. Do take him downstairs and let him have something to eat. For myself, Lucilla continued in a lower tone, it is my duty that keeps me up. You know, it has always been the object of my life to be a comfort to Papa. Come along, Tom, said the doctor. Don't waste your time philandering when your supper's ready. And Dr. Marjoribanks led the way downstairs, leaving Tom, who followed him, in a state of great curiosity to know what secret oppression it might be under, which his cousin was supported by her duty. He is. I still don't like Tom. I don't like Tom. I don't like him at all. Like, I know Miss Marjoribanks has her flaws, and technically ignoring them is okay because we all know that they're flaws. But on the other hand, the audacity. Because, like, he's over here, she's telling him that, like, oh, I have a duty to look after my dad. And he's over here being like, what kind of duty could you possibly be having? And that is so rude, in my opinion. I don't like Tom. I don't. Also, stop hitting on your cousin. We don't like Tom. No one likes Tom. Naturally, his thoughts reverted to a possible rival, someone whom the sensible doctor would have nothing to say to, and his very ears grew red with excitement at the idea. But notwithstanding, he ate a very satisfactory meal in the library, where he had to answer all sorts of questions. Tom had his tray at the end of the table, and the doctor, who had, according to his hospitable old-fashioned habit, taken a glass of claret to keep him company, sat in the easy chair between the fire and the table, and sipped his wine, admired its color and purity in the light, and watched with satisfaction the excellent meal his nephew was making. He asked him all about his prospects and what he was doing, which Tom replied to with the frankest confidence. He was not very fond of work, nor were his abilities anything out of the common. But at the present moment, Tom saw no reason why he should not gain the woolsack in time. And Dr. Marjoribanks gave something like a sigh as he listened, and wondered much what Providence could be thinking of not to give him the boy. So, I still don't like Tom. um, Tom's eating and talking about his work while, Mr. Marjoribanks, doctor, I suppose, is listening to him speak. And he is lying through his teeth about his accomplishments, at least a little bit. He's making it sound a lot grander than they are. And that's why Dr. Marjoribanks is sitting there lamenting, like, man, this is such a good boy. Why couldn't I have him as a son? But he's lying. We hate Tom. I don't like him. It's okay, the book's good. But, like, is there anything good about Tom? It's not like he's bad at his job, he's just mediocre and he decides to do it. Not because he feels any pressure, but because he wants to get one over on Dr. Marjoribanks so he would be like, I don't know, more receptive to him, which he is as a result. But, like, that doesn't make me like Tom, does it? Good lord. Lucilla, meantime, was very much occupied upstairs. She had the new housemaid up nominally to give her instructions about Mr. Tom's room, but really to take the covers off the chairs and see how they looked when the room was lighted up. But the progress of decay had gone too far to stand that trial. After all, Chintis, though none of the freshest, was the best. When the gentleman came upstairs, which Tom, to the doctor's disgust, insisted on doing, Lucilla was found in the act of pacing the room, pacing not in the sentimental sense of making a little promenade up and down, but in a homely practical signification, with a view of measuring that she might from an idea how much carpet was required. Lucilla was tall enough to go through this process without any great drawbacks in point of grace, the long step giving rather a tragedy queen effect to her handsome but substantial person and long sweeping dresses. She stopped short, however, when she saw them and withdrew to the sofa, on which she had established her throne, and there was a little air of conscious pathos on her face as she sat down, which impressed her companions. As for Tom, he instinctively felt that it must have something to do with that mystery under which Lucilla was supported by her duty. I hate Tom. We hate Tom. No one likes Tom. It's not a bad name, but he's giving it a bad rap, I'm telling you. An irrelevant young man conceived immediately a violent desire to knock the fellow down, whereas there was no fellow at all in the case, unless it might be Mr. Holden, the upholsterer, whose visits Miss Marjoribanks would have received with greater enthusiasm at this moment than those of the most eligible eldest son of England. And then she gave a little pathetic sigh. What were you doing, Lucilla? Said her father. Rehearsing Lady Macbeth, I suppose? At least you looked exactly like it when I came into the room. No, Papa, said Lucilla sweetly. I was only measuring to see how much carpet we should want. And that, and Tom's coming made me think of old times. There's so much downstairs in the library that you don't feel it, but a lady has to spend her life in a drawing room, and then I always was so dramatic. It does not matter what is outside, I always find my pleasure at home. I cannot help it if it has a little effect on my spirits now and then, said Miss Marjoribanks, looking down upon her handkerchief. To be always surrounded with things that have such associations. What associations? Said the amazed doctor. To be sure, he had forgotten his wife. But it was He had forgotten his wife, but it was 4 years ago, and he had got used to her absence from her favourite sofa, and, on the whole, in that particular, had acquiesced in the arrangement of Providence. Really, Lucilla, I don't know what you mean. No, Papa, said Miss Marjoribanks with resignation. I know you don't, and that is what makes it so sad. But talking of new carpets, and I had such an adventure today that I must tell you. Quite one of my adventures. That very luckiest thing. It happened when I was out walking. I heard a voice out of the house in Grove Street, just the very thing to go with my voice. That is not a thing that happens every day, said Lucilla, for all that masters have always told me that my voice was something quite by itself. When I heard it, though, it was in Grove Street, and all the people about it. I could have danced for joy. It was a man's voice, I suppose, said Tom Marjoribanks in gloomy tones, and the doctor added, in his cynical way, "It's wonderful advantage to be so pleased about trifles. What number was it? For my part, I have not many patients in Grove Street," said Dr. Marjoribanks. "I would find a voice to suit you in another quarter if I were you." "Dear papa, it's such a pity that you don't understand," said Lucilla compassionately. "It turned out to be Barbara Lake, for of course I went in directly and found out. I never heard a voice that went so well with mine." If Miss Marjoribanks did not go into raptures over the contralto on its own merits, it was not from any jealousy, of which indeed she was incapable, but simply because its adaptation to her own seemed to her by far its most interesting quality, and indeed almost the sole claim it had to consideration from the world. "I still don't like Tom. I don't like Tom. I don't like Tom. The audacity of that man. I don't. Dr. Marjoribanks, Dr. Marjoribanks. We love Dr. Marjoribanks. He's like a misguided father a lot of the time, right? And none of the characters are perfect in here, which is an appeal. It's great. I don't like Tom though. It's funny how like the greatest antagonist in this entire novel so far, second to the protagonist. It's just some guy named Tom who is convinced of the significance of men in the life of his cousin. Good lord. "Barbara Lake," said the doctor. "There's something in that. If you can do her any good to get her teaching or anything. I have a regard for poor Lake. Poor little fellow. He kept up wonderfully since his wife died, and nobody expected of him." Dr. Marjoribanks continued, with a momentary dreary recollection of the time when the poor woman took farewell of her children, which indeed was the next day after that on which his own wife had nobody in particular to take farewell of, faded out of her useless life. Oh, that's unfortunate. "Yes," said Lucilla. "I mean her to come here and sing with me, but then one needs to organize a little first. I'm 19. How long is it since you were married, Papa?" 2 and 20 years, said Doctor abruptly. He did not observe the strangeness of the question, because he had been thinking for the moment of his wife, and perhaps his face was a trifle graver than usual, though neither of his young companions thought of remarking it. To be sure, he was not a young man, even when he married, but on the whole, perhaps, something more than this perfect comfort and respectability and those nice little dinners had seemed to shine on his horizon when he brought home his incapable bride. Oh, so was she already disabled by then? Huh, interesting. One moment. 2 and 20 years! Exclaimed Lucilla. "I don't mind talking before Tom, for he is one of the family. The things are all the same as they were when Mamma came home, though I'm sure nobody would believe it. I think it is going against Providence, for my part. Nothing was ever intended to last long, except the things the Jews, poor souls, were in on war in the desert, perhaps. Papa, if you have no objection, I should like to choose the colors myself." So I guess here's they're referring to the Bible a couple times. Um, it's interesting that she mentions the clothes in it as opposed to anything else. Generally, I love the way that her personality shines through in those little statements a lot of the time. It's like, yeah, this is what you take priority of in a way. But on the other hand, that makes her very non-controversial at the end of the day, which is a pleasure when it comes to classics. "There's a great deal in choosing colors that go well with one's complexion. People think of that for their dresses, but not for their rooms, which are so much more important. I should have liked blue, but blue gets so soon tawdry, I think. said Miss Marjoribanks, raising and looking at herself seriously in the glass, that I have enough complexion at present to venture upon a pale spring green. This little calculation, which a timid young woman would have taken care to do by herself, was stated publicly, with her usual discrimination. The doctor, who had looked a little grim at first, could not but laugh when he saw the sober look of care and thought with which Miss Marjoribanks exclaimed her capabilities in the glass. It was not so much the action itself that amused her father as the consummate ability of the young revolutionary. Dr. Marjoribanks was Scotch, and had respect for talent in every development, as is natural to his nation. Oh, so I wonder if that's the way they used to spell Scott. Huh. So you tell me I could have used like a Scottish accent in that? Actually, I have no idea how Scottish accent sounds. But it could have been useful. Hmm. It's much better to find things about characters over time so than just to have them all presented at once. So I like this in terms of literary devices, you know? Now then, where were we? Hmm. He did not even give his daughter the credit for sincerity which she deserved, but set it all to the score of her genius, which was complimentary, certainly, in one point of view. But the fact was that Lucilla was perfectly sincere, and that she did what was natural to her under guidance of her genius. So, as always, to be in good fortune, just as Tom Marjoribanks, under the guidance of his, brought discredit even upon those eternal audiences of English government which fixed the time of the Claringford Assizes. I love how the book hates him too, because I don't like Mr. Marjoribanks. I know he was kind of written to be this way, but like, it feels like a camaraderie with the book to hate him together. It's wonderful. Also, kind of good contrast, you know? Lucilla was quite in earnest in thinking that the color of the drawing room was an important matter, and that a woman of sense had very good reason for suiting it to her complexion, an idea which, accordingly, she proceeded to develop and explain. For one can't change one's dress, said Miss Marjoribanks, as often as one likes. At least, as often, you know. Oh, sorry, one can. For one can change one's dress, said Marjoribanks, as often as one likes. At least, as often, as one has dresses to change. But their furniture remains the same. I'm always a perfect guy, whatever I wear, when I sit against a red curtain. You mean, you men say that a woman always knows when she's good looking, but I have to say I know when I look a guy. What I mean is a delicate pale green, Papa. So here, from what I can like gather of this, is she knows when she looks. I think a guy in this case would mean, um, well, obviously not feminine, but also in a way that's opposite to pretty. So, and that is something that she finds like contrary to how people normally speak of such things, but nonetheless important when it comes to figuring these things out. So red is something that she finds she doesn't look flattering in or against, which is fair enough. I honestly do agree with her idea quite a bit, although because I don't think a house is the place where I would be expecting to be holding business dinners, that wouldn't be nearly as important to me as the comfort of the color. But I certainly understand her thought process here. Now, where were we? Now, for my part, I think it wears just as well as any other color, and all the painters say it is a very thing for the pictures. The carpet, of course, would be a darker shade, and as for the chairs, it is not at all necessary to keep to one color. Both red and violet go beautifully with green, you know. I'm sure Mr. Holden and I could settle all about it without giving you any trouble. Ooh, yes, wait, actually, hold on. I know I get like meaninglessly excited about this, which might be odd, but the combination of violet and green specifically feels like such a callback to me because that's also the colors that I pick to pair together very frequently because they do look nice and they kind of look like relaxing, and no matter what shade you go with, they will always look good together. So it's nice that, and also having chairs of different colors in a building can make it seem like a more homely and relaxed atmosphere. This is something. There was a cafe next to a place I lived, and it had. an artificial cafe sense to it for some time, which I really like because all the chairs are rainbow. Um, but nonetheless, they were all chairs in the same type of metal from the same company, and it looked artificial. And that's pretty normal for a cafe. You want a place that looks nice, but it doesn't look lived in, because, well, it's a cafe, not a house. But then at some point, they have rebranded slightly, where they have replaced all their furniture with furniture that they have gotten secondhand and otherwise. So some comfortable art chairs were right next to wooden chairs, and some of them were more antique looking, and some of them were a bit more modern. But it all, and then a few carpets in the play area and such things, and it all became much more busy because it used to be barely a place anybody goes to until they have set it up in a way where all the local families, no matter how big or small, would come together to sit there and feel right at home. And so a very similar idea is being brought about here, where it doesn't really matter what the chairs are. You want the room to still look nice, but you don't want it to look engineered in order to make sure the person sitting in it doesn't feel like they've been engineered too, which is a sin of its own. Who told you, Lucilla, said the doctor, that I meant to refurbish the house? He was even a little angry at her boldness, but at the same time he was so much amused and pleased in his heart to have so clever a daughter that all the tones that could produce terror were softened out of his voice. I never heard that was a sort of thing a man had to do for his daughter, said Dr. Marjoribanks, and I would like to know what I should do with all the finery when you get married, as I suppose you will by and by, and leave me alone in the house. Ah, that is the important God, it's Tom. Good lord. I'm really starting to hate the guy for no particular reason. No, actually, quite a few particular reasons. I could write an essay on how much I hate Tom, which isn't difficult because he's not a likable character, but that's fine. That is the important question, said Tom. As usual, it was Tom's luck. But then, when there did happen to be a moment when he ought to be silent, the unfortunate fellow could not help but speak. Perhaps I may marry sometime, said Miss Marjoribanks with composure. It would be foolish, to make any engagements, but that will depend greatly upon how you behave and how Claringford behaves, Papa. I give myself 10 years here, if you should be very good. By 29, I shall be going off a little, and perhaps it may be tiring for anything I can tell. Then, 10 years is a long time, and naturally, in the meantime, I want to look as well as possible. Stop a minute. I forgot to put down the number of places for the lens. Tom, please to do it over again for me. Of course, your steps are a great deal longer than mine. Tom is tired, said the doctor, and there are no new carpets coming out of my pockets. Besides, he's going to bed, and I'm going downstairs to the library. We may as well bid you a good night. These words, however, were addressed to deaf ears. Tom, as was natural, had started immediately to obey Lucilla, as he was in duty bound, and the old doctor looked on with little amazement and a little amusement, recognizing with something of the surprise which that discovery always gives to fathers and mothers, that his visitor cared 20 times more for what Lucilla said than for anything that his superior wisdom could suggest. He would have gone off and left them as a couple of young fools if it had not occurred to him all at once that since this sort of thing had begun, the last person in the world that he would choose to see dancing attendance on his daughter was Tom Marjoribanks. Thank God. Oh my God. Dr. Marjoribanks has all of my respect. We love Dr. Marjoribanks. Thank you for being an okay dad. Thank you, Dr. Marjoribanks. Thank God. I love how he's like I don't. This shouldn't be an extra praise to just be a normal good person. It really shouldn't. Oh, it's good that he is, though. So glad. We all hate Tom. Oddly enough, though, he had just been finding fault with Providence for not giving him a son instead of a daughter. He was not at all delighted nor grateful when Providence put before him the simple method of providing himself with the son he wanted. He took a great deal too much interest in Tom Marjoribanks to let him do anything so foolish. And as for Lucilla, the idea that, after all her accomplishments and her expensive education and her year in the continent, she should marry a man who had nothing disgusted the doctor. He kept his seat accordingly, though he was horribly bored by the drawing room and its claims, and wanted very much to return to the library and get into his slippers and his dressing gown. He's so autistic. We love him. We love him. It's great. Imagine it's such a relatable moment as well. Oh. No. It was rather a pretty picture on the whole, which he was regarding. Lucilla, perhaps as a view of this discussion, had put on green ribbons on the white dress, which she always wore in the evening, and her tawny curls and fresh complexion carried off triumphantly that difficult color. That's true. Green can be a difficult color, because it can look. On one hand, it has the most potential to look nice, but on the other hand, it also has the most potential to look like bog. So it's a very fair thing to say, in my opinion. Perhaps a critical observer might have said that her figure was a little too developed and substantial for these vestal robes, but then Miss Marjoribanks was young and could vary. She was standing by, not far from the fire, on the other side from the doctor, looking on anxiously while Tom measured the room with his long steps. "I never said you were to stride," said Lucilla. "Take moderate steps, and don't be so silly. I was going I was doing it myself famously if you had not come in and interrupted me. It's frightful to belong to a family where the men are so stupid," said Miss Marjoribanks, with a sigh of real distress, for, to be sure, the unlucky Tom immediately bethought himself to take small steps, like those of a lady, which all but threw him on his well-formed, meaningless nose. I don't know if to be happy or sad, honestly. Because, on one hand, thank God Tom fell on his nose. On the other hand, he couldn't even do this one thing right. And with Lucilla on whatever it is. Now, where is it? There we go. Lucilla shook her head with an exasperated look, and contracted her lips with disdain, as he passed her on his ill-omened career. Of course, he came right up against the little table on which she had, with her own hand, arranged a bouquet of geraniums and mignonette. Mignonette? Hmm. "It is what he always does," she said to the doctor calmly, as Tom arrived at the climax of his fate, and the look with which she accompanied these words, as she rang the bell smartly and promptly, mollified the doctor's heart. Not only did he fall on his nose, but he also fell on a table while at it, holding fresh flowers. Tom. Tom is a really bad name to say in exasperation, to be fair, because you can't be mad at a name like Tom for very long. It reminds me of a tomcat, and he's cute, which is unfortunate because Tom in this story is anything but that. Or perhaps disfortunate, because then we can hate on Tom more accurately. uh, or at least unabashedly. "Dear Papa," said Lucilla sweetly, "it is so dreadful to hear you—" Oh, wait, we're in the wrong. One moment. "I can tell you the size of the room if that is all you want," said Dr. Marjoribanks. "I suppose you mean to give parties and drive me out of my senses with dancing and singing. No, Lucilla, you must wait till you get married. That will never do for me." "Dear Papa," said Lucilla sweetly, "it is so dreadful to hear you say parties. Everybody knows that the only thing I care for in life is to be a comfort to you. And as for dancing, I saw at once that was out of the question. Dancing is all very well," said Miss Marjoribanks thoughtfully, "but it implies quantities of young people, and young people can never make what I call society. It is evenings I want to have, Papa. I'm sure you want to go downstairs, and I suppose Tom would think it civil to sit with me though he is tired, as I will show you a good example, and Thomas can pick up the table and the flowers at his leisure. Good night, Papa," said Lucilla, giving him her round, fresh cheek to kiss. She went out of the room with a certain triumph, feeling that she had fully signified her intentions, which is always an important matter, and shook hands in a condescending way with Tom, who had broken his shins in a headlong rush to open the door. She looked at him with an expression of mild despair and shook her head again as she accorded him with that sign of amity. "If you only would look a little where you were going," said Miss Marjoribanks. Perhaps she meant the words to convey an allegorical as well as positive meaning, as so many people have been found out to do. And then she pursued her peaceful way upstairs. As for the doctor, he went off to his library rubbing his hands, glad to be released, and laughing softly at his nephew's abashed looks. "She knows how to put him down, at least," the doctor said to himself, well pleased. And he was so much amused by his daughter's superiority to the vulgar festivity at parties that he almost gave in to the idea of refurnishing the drawing room to suit Lucilla's complexion. He rubbed his hands once more over the fire and indulged in a little laugh all by himself over that original idea. "So is it evening she means to have?" said the doctor, and to be sure nothing could be more faded than the curtains, and there were bits of carpet in which the pattern was scarcely discernible, so that, on the whole, up to this point, there seemed to be a reasonable prospect that Lucilla would have everything her own way. Hmm. Which is valid. Good, I suppose. Now we're on chapter 7. I'll take a swift drink of my tea, and then we shall continue. On the whole, actually, on a side note, I've recently tried. I couldn't find jasmine tea, but I have a type of green tea with me today, which is pear and maple syrup. It's actually not that bad. Um, but that's a bit of an update that I thought might be interesting. It's a shame there really was no jasmine around. But then on the other hand, I've heard an opinion of a roommate of mine that jasmine tea smells like cologne, apparently, and she's not a big fan of that. And so perhaps to some that is a blessing. Alright, now to chapter 7. Miss Marjoribanks had so many things to think of the next morning that she found her cousin, who was rather difficult to get rid of, much in her way. Naturally, the young man was briefless, and came on circuit for the name of the thing, and was quite disposed to dawdle the first morning, and attach himself to the active footsteps of Lucilla, and for her part, she had things to occupy herself very much more important. For one thing, one of Dr. Marjoribanks' little dinner parties was to take place that evening, which would be the first under the new regime, and was, naturally, a matter of some anxiety to all the parties. "I shall go down and ask Miss Chilly to come with me with the Colonel," said Lucilla. "I have always meant to do that. She can't have a full dinner party, as long as the house is so shabby, but I am sure Miss Chilly will come take care of me." "To take care of you in your father's house. These things will bite," said the doctor grimly, but as for Lucilla, she was quite prepared for that. "I must have a chaperone, she said. "I don't say it as not quite absurd, but then, at first, I always make that a point to give in to the prejudice of society. That is how I have always been so successful," said the experienced Lucilla. "I never went in the face of anybody's prejudices. Afterwards, when one is known." Fair enough. I support Lucilla's rights and wrongs. The doc, mm, it's actually funny because she is right, but on the other hand, it's not something that I would want to practice at all. Because if I see a point in societies that I think is doing more harm than good, I would not engage with it to begin with, as opposed to trying to change it from the inside, so to speak. But then again, there's range to these sorts of things. The doctor laughed, but at the same time he sighed. There was nothing to be said against Miss Shelley, who had, on the whole, as women go, a very superior training and knew what a good dinner was. But it was the beginning of the revolution of which Dr. Marjoribanks, vaguely oppressed with the idea of a new paper, new curtains, and all that was involved in the entrance of Mr. Holden, the upholster, into the house, did not see the end. He acquiesced, of course, since there was nothing else for it, but it must be confessed that the spectre of Miss Shelley sitting in the right hand clouded over for the doctor the pleasant anticipation of the evening. If it had been possible to put her at the head of the table beside Lucilla, whom was to be mm, whom she was to come to take care of, he could have borne it better, and to be sure it would have been a great deal more reasonable. But then that was absolutely out of the question, and the doctor gave in with a sigh. Thus it was that he began to realize the more serious result of the semi-abdiction into which he had been beguiled. So he has a good point with it a little bit. He obviously wants to hang out with the boys, I guess. But the issue is Miss Shelley has to sit next to her husband. And if Miss Shelley was to be talking with Lucilla, then they would be talking all the way across the table. And that would interrupt the conversation that the guys around would be having. And so he wasn't particularly happy with that particular circumstance. The female element, so long peacefully ignored and kept at distance, had come in again in triumph and taken possession, and the doctor knew too well by experience of a long life what a restless and troublesome element it was. He had begun to feel that it had ceased to be precisely amusing as he took his place in his brougham. It was a good sport to see Lucilla make an end of Tom and put her bridle upon the stiff neck of Nancy, but when it came to changing the character of doctors' dinners, his intellect naturally got more obtuse, and he did not see the joke. Ah, yeah. As for Tom, he had to be disposed of similarly. Do go away. Sorry, do go away, Miss Marjoribanks said in her straightforward way. You can come back to luncheon if you like. That is to say, if you can pick up anybody that is very amusing, you may bring him here about 1:30. And if any one of my friends have come to call by that time, I will give you lunch. But it must be somebody very amusing, or I will have nothing to say to you, said Lucilla, and with this dismissal, Tom Marjoribanks departed, not more content with the doctor. For, to be sure, the last thing in the world which the poor fellow thought of was to bring somebody who was amusing to injure his chances with Lucilla. We hate Tom. We hate Tom. Oh, I mean, that was predictable, but like, we hate Tom. We really do. Tom, why are you like this? Can I speak to your mother to understand? Truly, please. I want to call your mom to know what went wrong along any part of that journey. Why? I don't like Tom. Mm. Tom, like most other people, was utterly incapable of fathoming the grand conception which inspired Miss Marjoribanks. When she told him that it was the object of her life to be a comfort to Papa, he believed it to a certain extent, but it never occurred to him that filial devotion, though beautiful to contemplate, would Lucilla's heart preserve Lucilla's heart from the ordinary dangers of youth, or that she was at all in earnest in postponing all matrimonial intentions until she was 99 and 20, and had begun to go off a little. So she went away disc- disconsolate enough. My bad. So he went away disconsolate enough, wavering between his instinct of obedience and his desire of being in Lucilla's company, and a desperate determination never to be the means of injuring himself by presenting to her anybody who was very amusing. While Miss Marjoribanks' Monte, as it happened, was a little out of humour that day. She had gone on so far triumphantly that it had now come to be necessary that she should receive a little check in her victorious career. A little check in her victorious career. When Tom was disposed of, Miss Marjoribanks put on her hat and went down Grange Lane to carry her invitation to Miss Chilly, who, naturally, very much pleased to come. "But, my dear, you must tell me what to put on," the old lady said. "I don't think I have had anything new since you were home last. I have heard so much about Dr. Marjoribanks' dinners that I feel a little excited, as I was going to be made a Freemason or something. As if I was going to be made a Freemason or something. There's my brown, that I wear to home when we have anybody, and my black velvet, and then there is a French grey that I got from Mary Chilly's marriage." "Dear Miss Chilly," said Lucilla, "it doesn't matter in the least what you wear. Those are only to be gentlemen, and one never dresses for gentlemen. You must keep that beautiful black velvet for another time." "Well, my dear," said Miss Chilly, "I am long past that sort of thing, but the men think, that it is always for them when we dress."
Oh my god, can I like frame these two lines? I love this book. I don't think there's even like feminist literature on like list of feminist. I don't know how that works, honestly. But like, uh, I love the narrative and the way that Lucilla interacts with her like characters. Because Miss Chilly is, a grandmother. She's old. Well, she's an older woman, right? I'm not sure if she's a grandmother. I think so. Something about her voice was that. Um, Pretty sure, right? And Lucilla speaks of like, that like when we go out and when we put on the pretty dresses, it's because we want to feel pretty. Um, it is for us, not for the like men. And then the Miss Chilly goes, "Yes, but you know how they always think it is for them when we dress up." And it's interesting the way that it's still a point of discussion today when this book was written like 100, 200 years ago, It's kind of sweet in a way. And I love seeing them talk about it in a way that gives them autonomy. Mm. It also passes the Bechdel test, actually, because there's two women talking about things outside of men for bed. And they do that very frequently here, obviously. Which, to be fair, there's like, men are not a big part of this book, and that's there, right? So that could be also part of it. But yeah, mhm. It's nice to see the way that the world still is and where those lines are coming from. Because Miss Chile is sort of like a point of authority in a way, um, just in terms of how long that she's lived, right? And hearing this kind of, I guess, tongue-in-cheek in a way coming from her is refreshing. And I honestly, this entire book kind of reading it tastes like a good glass of lemonade to me. Mm. Especially compared to like some of the previous books that we have read on this channel, because there was the one male-led narrative just before about Sherlock Holmes that we were reading, because there was one, maybe two women in there. Three if you squint, but honestly. Um, and so that builds a very different kind of feeling for it than this one does, because it almost has the inverse situation going on. And I really like the variety. I do, Um, Similarly to that, right before we obviously read the Metamorphosis by Franz Kafka. And the thing about Metamorphosis is it did have complex family dynamics, and it did have, um, I mean, I don't, I think it has women pass. I don't know if it's a woman pass the Bechdel test or not, because it depends on whether or not you consider the main character a man after his publication, maybe. There's a couple points. Anyway, not the point. But it has a completely different vibe in itself because it's so depressing in its way. I mean, I didn't find the book depressing myself per se, but in the way that it's written, it doesn't leave much for the more optimistic part of the imagination. And here it does, and it has that complexity, and it's refreshing, you know? Mm-hmm. Yes, said Miss Marjoribanks, their vanity is something dreadful, but it is one of my principles never to dress unless there are ladies. A white frock, high in the neck, and Lucilla said with sweet simplicity, as for anything else, it would be a bad style. If anything else, at least she's a girl's girl, you know? In a way. Miss Shelley gave her young visitor a very cordial kiss when she went away. The sense she has, said the old lady, but at the same time the colonel's wife was so old-fashioned that this contemptuous way of treating the gentleman puzzled her unprogressive intelligence. She thought it was a superhuman version on Lucilla's part, nearly incredible, and yet established by proofs so incontestable that it would be a shame to doubt it, and she felt ashamed of herself. She, who might have been a grandmother, had such been the will of Providence, for lingering 5 minutes undecided between her two best caps. Fair enough. I dare say Lucilla does not spend so much time on such vanity, and she's only 19, said the patient old lady. As for Miss Marjoribanks, she returned up Grange Lane with a mind at ease, and that consciousness of superior endowments which gives amiability and expansion even to the countenance. Even to the countenance. She did not give any money to the beggar who at the period infested Grange Lane with her 6 children, for that was contrary to those principles of political economy which she had studied with such success at Mount Pleasant. But she stopped and asked her name and where she lived, and promised to inquire into her case. Ooh, that's interesting. Okay, let's see where that goes. If you are honest and want to work, I will try to find you something to do, said Miss Marjoribanks, which, to be sure, was a threat appalling enough to keep her free from any further molestation on the part of that interesting family. But Lucilla, to do her justice, felt it equally natural that beneficence should issue from her in the manner as in that other mode of feeding the hungry, which she was willing to adopt to 1:30, and had solemnly engaged herself to fulfil at 7 o'clock. She went up after that to Mr. Holden's and had a most interesting conversation, and found among his stores a delicious damask, a softly spiritually green, of which, to his great astonishment, she tried the effect in one of the great mirrors which ornamented the shop. It is just the tint I want, Lucilla said, when she had applied the unusual test, and she left the fashionable upholsterer of Clarringford in a state of some uncertainty whether it was curtains or dresses that Miss Marjoribanks meant to have made. That's cute. That's adorable to me. Because, like, not in a romantic sense, but more in just, like, the sense of when you look at a thing or situation and you kind of like, it's kind of like when you see kittens playing together, or like a dog and a cat, I guess, where one of them is clearly confused, but they're getting along. And so it gives you that kind of like idea of it, you know? Perhaps this confusion arose from the fact that Lucilla's mind was occupied in discussing the question whether she should not go around by Grove Street and try that duet again with Barbara, and invite her to Grange Lane in the evening to electrify the little company, or whether, in case this latter idea might not be practicable, she should bring Barbara with her to lunch by the way of occupying Tom Marjoribanks. Lucilla stood at Mr. Holden's door for 5 seconds, at least balancing the matter. But finally she gave her curls a little shake, and took a quick step forward, and, without any more deliberation, returned towards Grange Lane, for, on the whole, it was better not to burst in full triumph all at once upon her constituency, and exhaust her forces at the beginning. She condescended to sing something herself. It would indeed be a greater honour than her father's dinner party, in strict justice, was entitled to.
And so, for the second question, though, Miss Marjoribanks was too happy in the confidence of her own powers to fear any rivals, and though her cousin's devotion bored her. Still, she felt doubtful how far it was good policy to produce Barbara at luncheon for the purpose of occupying Tom. Other people might see her besides Tom, and her own grand coup might be forestalled for anything she could tell. And then Tom had some title to consideration on his own merits, though he was the unlucky member of the family. He might even, if he were so far left to himself, though Miss Marjoribanks smiled at the idea, fall in love with Barbara, or what was more likely, driven to despair by Lucilla's indifference, he might pretend to fall in love. And Lucilla reflected that if anything happened, she could never forgive herself. This was the point she had arrived at when she shook her tawny curls and set out suddenly on her route to return home. Don't forget water. Alright, we're back. It was nearly 1 o'clock, and it was quite possible that Tom, as well herself, might be on the way to Grange Lane. But Lucilla, who, as she said, made a point of never going against the prejudices of society, made up her mind to remain sweetly unconscious of the hour of luncheon, unless some lady came up to her company. But then Miss Marjoribanks was always lucky, as she said. A quarter of an hour before Tom applied for admission, Miss Berry came to pay Lucilla a visit. She had been visiting in her district all morning. Hmm. She had been visiting in her district all the morning, and was very easily persuaded to repose herself a little, and then, naturally, she was anxious about her young friend's spiritual condition, and the effect upon her mind of a year's residence abroad. She was asking whether Lucilla had not seen something so degrading and dishonouring to religion in all the mummeries of popery. And Miss Marjoribanks, who was perfectly orthodox, had replied to the question in the most satisfactory manner. So, Orthodox as an Orthodox Christian, I suppose. When Tom made his appearance, looking rather sheepish and reluctant, and followed by the somebody amusing whom Lucilla had commissioned him to bring. He had struggled against his fate, poor fellow, but when it happens to be a man's instinct to do what he is told, he can no more resist it than if it were a criminal impulse. Tom entered with his amusing companion, who had been chosen with care and was very uninviting to look at, and by Miss Berry, with the most puzzled looks, found herself listening to gossip about the Sears and all kinds of profane subjects. Oh no! Oh Lord, that was hilarious. So I imagine being there. This is why this book is so fun. So Miss Berry is obviously a very Christian woman, and to the point where she worries about other Christian denominations or like exposure to other religions as being corrupting. Hence, she was asking for the state of her soul. Now, the company that Tom has decided to bring himself is one of with stories of debauchery, and the theater can be a profane place at the time, because nowadays it's kind of like evolved into something sophisticated. But back in the day, that's not the case. It wasn't always a sophisticated place to be. Sophisticated gentlemen hang out at the theater, um, but not always looking for sophisticated things, if that is an understanding. How do I phrase this? If you worked at the theater, your best hope is to get commissioned by somebody who is with money. And that often leads to very unfair power structure. And that power structure can lead to questionable pursuits, exploitation, or the way that you present yourself during your performances being more, for the time, explicit, And by that I mean, the times when like showing an ankle is kind of a bit too much. So a similar thing can be said of the theater, and also not to mention the way that theaters, in plural, refers to a bunch of different institutions where you would watch people for entertainment, right? So they have bought. This is like a face-off. You know those YouTube face-offs where they're like one Christian versus 10 atheists or whatever. This is the exact same scenario, just one on one. So at least it's equal, I guess. Oh, a place to be. It's funny how like for Miss Marjoribanks, at least it's lucky because this is definitely amusing. But on Tom's account, this is the most unluckiest thing you could have possibly done. Ugly or not, but this is going to be something. At least in that company context. Now, where were we? Oh God. Hmm. Yeah, profane subjects. Hmm. I think they're going to hang that fellow that killed the tailor, said the amusing man. Oh God, no! It's almost worse. So profane can mean a variety of things. It could be what we currently consider profanity, but it also could be subjects that are explicit when it comes to like mentions of death or other things, I suppose, in this case. Oh my God, I can't with this. Oh, good Lord. Hmm. So I guess he was looking at a play of maybe something like Shakespeare, I guess. Oh, hey, tragedy. That will stir you up a little in Claringford, I should suppose. It is as good as a play of a country town. Of course, there will be a party that will get up a memorial and prove that a man so kind-hearted never existed out of paradise. And there will be another party who will prove him to be insane. And then, at the end, all the blackguards with 100 miles will crowd into Claringford, and the fellow will be hanged, as he deserves to be. But I assure you, it's a famous amusement for a country town. Sir, said Miss Berry, with a tremulous voice, for her feelings had overcome her. When you speak of amusement, does it ever occur to you what will become of his miserable soul? I assure you, wretches of that description have no souls, said the young barrister. Or else, of course, I would not permit myself to speak so freely. It is a conclusion I have come to not rashly, but after many opportunities of observing. The young man went on with solemnity. On the whole, my opinion is that this is the great difference between one portion of mankind and the other. That description of being, you may take my word for it, has no soul. This I love this book. It's so amusing. Oh my God. I never take anybody's word for what it is so plainly stated in the Holy Scriptures, said Miss Berry. I never heard anyone utter such a terrible idea. I'm sure I don't want to defend a murder, cried the rector's sister with agitation. But I have heard of persons in that unfortunate position coming to a heavenly frame of mind and giving every evidence of it being truly converted. The law may take their lives, but it is an awful thing, a truly dreadful thing, said Miss Berry, trembling all over, to try and take away their soul. Oh, nonsense, Lucilla! By Jove, he does not mean that, you know that. Sir, oh, it's Tom. Oh, oh, nonsense, Lucilla. By Jove, he does not mean that, said Tom, interposing to relieve his friend. Do you believe in Jove, Mr. Thomas Marjoribanks? Said Miss Berry, looking him in an alarming manner full in the face. The unfortunate Tom grew red, and then he grew even green under this question and that awful look. No, Miss Berry, I can't say I do, he answered humbly. And the amusing man was so much less brotherly than Tom that he burst into unsympathetic laughter. As for Lucilla, it was the first real check she had sustained in the beginning of her career. There could not have been a more unfortunate contretemps. and there is no telling how disastrous the effect might have been had not her the courage and coolness, not to say her orthodoxy, been equal to the occasion. She gave her cousin a look which was still more terrible than Miss Berry's, and then she took affairs into her own hands. Thank God, that tea party was falling apart. Well, luncheon, not tea party. Hmm. It is dreadful sometimes to see what straits people are up to keep up the conversation, said Lucilla. Tom in particular, for I think he has a pleasure in taking nonsense. But you must not suppose I am of that opinion. I remember quite well there was a dreadful man once here in jail, or for something, and Mr. Bury made him the most beautiful character. Every creature has a soul. I'm sure we say so in this creed every day of our lives, and especially in that long creed where so many people perish everlastingly. So far from laughing, it is quite dreadful to think of it, said Lucilla. It is one of my principles never to laugh about anything that has to do with religion. I always think it my duty to speak with respect. It has such a bad effect upon some minds, Miss Berry. If you will not take anything more, I think we had better go upstairs. To think that Tom, whose luck, as usual, had betrayed him to such an unlooked-for extent, should have been on the point of following to the drawing-room, was more than Miss Marjoribanks could comprehend. But fortunately his companion had more sense, and took his leave, taking him conductor with him. Miss Berry went upstairs in silence, sighing heavily from time to time. The good woman was troubled in her spirits at the evident depravity of the young men with whom circumstances had constrained her to sit down at the table, and she was sadly afraid that such companionship must have debashing effects upon the mind of that lamb of the flock now standing before her. Miss Berry bethought herself of Dr. Marjoribanks' profane jokes, and the indifference he had showed to many things in which it was his duty to have interest in himself, and she could not but look with her tender pity in her young friend's face. "Poor dear," said Miss Berry, "it is dreadful indeed if this is the sort of society you are subject to. I could recommend to Dr. Marjoribanks a most admirable woman, a true Christian, who would take charge of things and be your companion, Lucilla. It is not at all nice for you, at your age, to be obliged to receive young men like these alone." "I had you," said Lucilla, taking both Miss Berry's hands. "I felt it was such a blessing. I would not have let Tom stay for luncheon if you had not been there. And now I'm so glad, because it has shown me the danger of letting him bring people. I'm quite sure it was a special providence that made you think of coming here today." "Well, my dear, well, my dear," said Miss Berry, who was naturally mollified by the statement of the question, "I'm very glad to have been of use to you. If there is anything I desire in this life, it is to be useful to my fellow creatures, and to do my work while it is called day. I should not think the time lost, my dear Lucilla, if I could only hope that I had impressed upon your mind that an account must be given of every careless word." "Oh, yes," said Lucilla, "this is so true, and besides, it is quite against my principles. I make it a point never to speak of anything about religion except with the greatest respect, and I'm quite sure it was a special providence that I had you." Miss Berry had took her farewell very affectionately, not to say effusively, after this, with her heart melting over the ingenious young creature who was so thankful for her protection. But at the same time she left Miss Marjoribanks a prey to the horrible sensation of having made a failure. To be sure, there was time to recover herself in the evening, which was, so to speak, her first formal appearance before the public of Claringford. Tom was so ill-advised as to come in when she was having her cup of tea before dinner, fortify her for her exertions, and the reception he met with may be left to the imagination. But after all, there was a little satisfaction in demolishing Tom, and then Lucilla had known from the beginning that the success of her undertaking depended entirely on herself. First of all, true. Second of all, great that we demolished Tom. Third of all, I'm kind of happy it wasn't even written down. It's great that it's left to the reader's imagination. Now, depending on how much you hate Tom, you may say one thing or another about it. And I think that's wonderful. You don't always have to describe everything for it to be said. Hmm. Now we are on Chapter 8. And it is at this point that I shall take a brief break, and I encourage you, if you have any questions about the novel so far, to also write them down, or just anything at all. And then I can look at them after break as well. And that would be quite lovely. So far, break. I'll read everything, and I'll read some more of the book. Good tidings, we're back to reading chapter 8. It's such a good book. It's going to become one of my favorites, actually, I think. So far, my favorite is The Picture of Dorian Gray, but I don't know. It's coming like this is a very close second so far. That being said, we have 400 and something pages left to go, so we'll see how it actually goes. Chapter 8. Actually, how many chapters are there before I continue? I want to know. Oh, okay. What number is L? I've never reached L in Roman numerals. 30. No, it's 30, 30, 30, 30, 30, 30, 30, 30. L. I don't know. This is 36, 37, 38, 39, 40. Okay, 40, 50. Oh, so it 50, 51? 51 chapters. Well, 52 actually, because there's chapter the last, whatever that means. And then endnotes, but we don't count endnotes. Alright. Chapter 8. The evening passed off in a way which if Miss Marjoribanks had been an ordinary woman, would have altogether obliterated from her mind all recollection of the failure at lunch. To speak first of the most important particular, the dinner was perfect. As for the benighted men who had doubted Lucilla, they were covered with shame, and at the same time with delight. There had been a fault in Dr. Marjoribanks' table under the ancient regime. It lay in a certain want of variety, and occasionally overabundance, which wounded the feelings of young Mr. Cavendish, who was a person of refinement. Tonight, as the accomplished critic remarked, there was a certain air of feminine grace diffused over everything, and an amount of doubt and expectation, and unknown to the composed feastings of old, gave interest to the meal. As for the doctor, he found Miss Shelley at his right hand not so great a bore as he expected. She was a woman capable of appreciating the triumphs of art that were set before her, and had indeed been trained to as high a pitch of culture in this respect as perhaps is possible to the female intelligence. And then her pride and delight in being admitted to a participation in these sacred mysteries was beyond expression. My dear Lucilla, I feel exactly as if I was going to be made a Freemason, and as if your dear good papa had blindfolded me and made me swear all sorts of things before he took me downstairs, she said, as they sat together waiting for the commencement of the ceremony. And when the two ladies returned to the drawing room, Miss Shelley took Lucilla in her arms, and gave her a kiss as the only way of expressing adequately her enthusiasm. My love, said the Coleman's wife, I've never realized before that it was to have a genius. You should be very thankful to Providence for giving you such a gift. I have given dinners all my life, that is, all my married life, my dear, which comes to almost the same thing, for I was only a baby, but I never could have come up to anything like that, said Miss Shelley, with tears in her eyes. As for Miss Marjoribanks, she was so satisfied with her success that she felt at liberty to tranquilize her old friend. I'm sure you always give very nice dinners, she said. And then, the Colonel has his favorite dishes, whereas I must say for Papa, he's very reasonable for a man. I'm so glad you are pleased. It is very kind of you to say it is genius, but I don't pretend to anything but paying great attention and studying the combinations. There is nothing one cannot manage if one only takes the trouble. Come here to this nice easy chair. It is so comfortable. It is so nice to have a little moment to ourselves before they come upstairs. Did I mention autism? I'm gonna mention it again. So I like the way that she phrases it here, which is that she doesn't see herself as a genius. Obviously, here is a thing that does go without saying. It's not the thing that I like. I'm particular about the part where she says, but paying a great attention and studying the combinations. So the way that she views this is in a very autistic manner as well. So the she'll notice people's patterns and then she'll study them, and in doing so, she will create an atmosphere based on these things, kind of like a spreadsheet, you know. If A and B, she's treating it like a formula, and that's also a common thing for autistic women trying to learn social cues and like that sort of thing. It's like her special interest. She's very passionate about it. But I like the fact that it mentions how mathematic it is that she like goes at it. You know, like yes. I don't know if I'm the only person noticing the sheer amount of autism in this book, but I sure hope not, because it's right there and it's so obvious, clearly. But then again, it's a relatively. It wasn't really a thing back then, as in the diagnosis is relatively new, and then it's even newer for it to not be exclusively a male one. Was It's only very recent years that we've put a little bit more care into diagnosing women and discussing what it looks like in a woman. But even then, there's still a long way to go. Still, I find it really nice to see literature like this that is so old, that kind of makes people feel included in a way, even by having such unique characters as their main characters. It can also be relatable to people, you know? And that's nice. Hmm.
That is what I always say, said Miss Shelley. But there are not many girls so sensible as you, Lucilla. I hear them all saying it is so much better French fashion. Of course, I'm an old woman, and I like things the old style.
Oh, wait. Yes, there you go.
I don't think it is because I am more sensible, said Miss Marjoribanks with modesty. I don't pretend to be better than other people. It is because I have thought it all over, you know. And then I went through a course of political economy when I was in Mount Pleasant, Lucilla said tranquilly, with an air of having explained the whole matter, which was impressed her hearer, which must have impressed her hearer.
I wish we'd use that word more often, because I think it might be a dead word at this point. So, hear arisen from the word to hear something or someone. So, I wish some of the words that we don't use nowadays could be so useful, this being one of them.
But for all that, something dreadful happened today. Tom brought in one of his friends with him, you know, and Miss Berry was there, and they talked, I want to tell you, in case you should say something, and then you will know what to believe. I never felt so dreadfully ashamed in my life. They talked, my dear, not anything improper, I hope, cried the old lady in dismay. Oh no, said Lucilla. But they began laughing about some people having no souls, you know, as if there could anybody without a soul, and poor Miss Berry nearly fainted. You may think what a dreadful thing it was for me. My dear child, if that was all, said Miss Chilly reassured. As for everybody having a soul, I'm sure I cannot say. You never were in India, to be sure, but Miss Berry should have known better than to faint at a young man's talk, and frighten you, my poor dear. She ought to be ashamed of herself at her age. Do you think Tom has turned out clever? The old lady continued, not without a little finesse, and watching Lucilla with a curious eye. Not in the very least, said Miss Marjoribanks calmly. He's just as awkward and as he used to be. It is dreadful to have him here just now, when I have so many things to do, and then he would follow me about everywhere if I would let him. A cousin of that sort is always annoying. I'm always afraid of a cousin, for my part, said Miss Chilly. And talking of that, what do you think of Mr. Cavendish, Lucilla? He's very nice in himself, and he has a nice property. And some people say he has a very good chance to be member of Cleringford when there is an election. I think that is just what would suit you. I could not see him for the lamp, said Lucilla. It was right between us, you know, but it is no use talking of that sort of thing just now. Of course, if I had liked, I never need have to come home at all, Miss Marjoribanks added with composure. And now I have come home. I have got other things to think of.
If Papa is good, I will not think of leaving him for 10 years. Oh, yes, I have heard girls say that before, said Miss Shelley. But they always change their minds. You would not like to be an old maid, Lucilla, and in 10 years I should have begun to go off a little, no doubt, said Miss Marjoribanks. No, I can't say I wish to be an old maid. Can he be coming upstairs already, do you think? Oh, it is Tom, I suppose, said Lucilla with a little indignation. But when they did make their appearance, which was at a tolerably early period, for a return to the drawing-room was quite a novelty for Dr. Marjoribanks' friends, and tempted them accordingly. Miss Marjoribanks was quite ready to receive them, and just before 10 o'clock, Marjorie... Huh, oh right, 10 o'clock, when Miss Shelley began to think of going home, Lucilla, without being asked, and without, indeed, a word of preference, suddenly went to the piano, and before anybody knew, had commenced to sing. She was a great deal too sensible to go into a high art on the occasion, or to electrify her father's friends with her newly acquired Italian, or even with German, as some young ladies do. She sang them a ballad out of one of those treasures of resuscitated ballads which the new generation had then begun to dig out of the bowels of the earth. Again, can I say, this is also something that repeats nowadays as well, and it's so good to see, you know, which is to say, what this is currently telling of is she sings one of those songs that is an old song and then is currently very popular again, where they found it from who knows where, but clearly, that's a thing. And it's a very similar thing that happens all the time. I don't want to say nowadays because that's not accurate because, well, it happens every decade to every generation where they'll find something old and then they'll revitalize it. And so a similar thing here. Hmm. It happens quite often with music, and then they'll put a little new spin on it without them noticing. But yeah, a moment. Right. So, where were we? There was not, to tell the truth, a great deal of music in it, which proved Lucilla's disinterestedness. I only sang it to amuse you, she said, when all the world crowded to the piano, and for that night she was not to be persuaded to further exertions. Thus Miss Marjoribanks proved to her little public that power of subordinating her personal tastes and even her vanity to her great object, which was than anything else demonstrates a mind made to rule. Which was more than anything else demonstrates a mind made to rule. Oh, that's interesting. So in a way, she's domineering, right? But to showcase that you are willing to take on and accommodate with the ideas of others without needing to be asked, um, kind of showcases that you can have their interest in mind, which for a leader is important to have your public's interest in mind. So I guess that's the argument being made here. Mm. This is better than reading Sun Tzu, I know. Oh no, I don't know what ways to give Mr. Cavendish. Ah. Hmm. I hope next. No, that's wrong. I hope next time you will be more charitable and not tantalize us in this way, Mr. Cavendish said as he took his leave, and Lucilla retired from the scene of her triumph, conscious of having achieved entire success in her first appearance in Clarringford. She laid her head upon her pillow with that sweet sense of approving conscience which accompanies the footsteps of the benefactors of their kind. But even Miss Marjoribanks' satisfaction was not without its drawbacks. She could not get out of her mind that unhappy abortive luncheon and all its horrors, not to speak of the possibility of her religious principles being impinged. She was dreadful in it, which was dreadful in itself. For people can stand a man being skeptical, Miss Marjoribanks justly observed. But everybody knows how unbecoming it is in a woman, and me, who have such a respect for religion. There remained the still more alarming chance that Miss Bury, who was so narrow-minded, might see something improper in the presence of two young men at Lucilla's maidenly table, for, to be sure, the rector's sister was altogether incapable of grasping the idea that young men, like old men and the other less interesting members of human family, were simple material for Miss Marjoribanks' genius, out of which she had a great result to produce. This was the dread that overshadowed the mind of Lucilla as she composed herself to rest after her fatigues. It's funny because, okay, this is what they kind of meant when they earlier said that Miss Marjoribanks said that she preferred the company of men. It's not that she was, like, trying to be more boyish or anything like that, but specifically that she had been unopposed to it in the first place, in a way. That comes off as a preference in a more divided society, like we see here with the more narrow-minded perspective of it. When she slept the sleep of the innocent, it still pursued her into her dreams. She dreamt that she stood at the altar by the side of the member of Carlingford, and that Mr. Bury, with inflexible cruelty, insisted upon marrying her to Tom Marjoribanks instead. And then the scene changed, and instead of receiving the salutations of Mr. Cavendish as MP for the borough, it was the amusing man, in the character of the defeated candidate, who grinned and nodded at her, and said from the hustings that he would never forget the luncheon that had been his first introduction to Carlingford. Such was the nightmare that pursued Lucilla even into the sphere of dreams. When such a presentiment takes possession of a well-balanced mind like that of Miss Marjoribanks, it may be accepted as certain that something is likely to follow. Lucilla did her best to disarm fate, not only by the sweetest submission and dutifulness to the doctor and his wishes, but by a severe disregard of Tom, which drove the unhappy young man nearly desperate. Far from saying anything about luncheon, she even ignored his presence at breakfast, and remained calmly unconscious of his empty cup until he had to ask for some coffee in an injured and pathetic voice, which amused Dr. Marjoribanks beyond description. But even this did not prove sufficient to propitiate the fates. When they were gone, and it may be well to say that Lucilla used this pronoun to signify the gentleman, in greater or smaller number as it might happen. When she had finished all her arrangements, Miss Marjoribanks decided upon going to Grove Street to pay Barbara Lake a visit, and practice some duets, which was certainly as innocent an occupation for her leisure as could be desired. She was putting on her hat with the object when the bell in the garden rang solemnly, and Lucilla, whose curiosity conquered her good manners for the moment, hastened to the window, saw Mr. Berry himself enter the garden, accompanied by a black figure in a deep shabby mourning. All the tremors of that night rushed back upon her mind at the sight. She felt the moment had arrived for a trial of her courage, very different from the exertions which had hitherto sufficed her. Nothing but the most solemn intentions could have supported the rector in the severe pose of his figure and features, every line of which revealed an intention of being faithful, and the accompanying mute in the black, whose office the culprit could not divine, had a veil over her face, and wore a widow's dress. Miss Marjoribanks, it is true, was not a woman to be discouraged by appearances, but she felt her heart beat as she collected all her powers to meet this mysterious assault. She took off her hat with an instinctive certainty that, for this morning, at last, the duet was impracticable, when she heard Mr. Bury's steady step ascending the stairs. But notwithstanding, it was with a perfectly cheerful politeness that she bade him welcome when he came into the room. "It is so good for you to come," Lucilla said. "You have so much to do. I scarcely could believe it when I saw you come in. I thought it must be for papa." "I did hope to find Dr. Marjoribanks," said the rector, "but as he is not at home, I thought it best to come to you. This is Miss Mortimer," said Mr. Bury, taking a chair. Lucilla had indicated with a certain want of observance of his companion, which betrayed at the keen perceptions of Miss Marjoribanks that she was a dependent of some kind or other. The rector was a very good man, but was evangelical, and had a large female circle who admired and swore by him, and consequently he felt it in a manner natural that he should take his seat first, and the place that belonged to him as the principal person present. And then, to be sure, his mission here was for Miss Mortimer's as well as Miss Marjoribanks' good. After this introduction, the figure in black put up its veil and revealed deprecating a deprecating woman with a faint sort of pleading smile on her face. Probably she was making believe to smile at the position in which she found herself, but anyhow she took her seat humbly on the other another chair at a little distance, and waited, as Lucilla did, for the next golden words that it might please the rector to say. My sister told me what happened yesterday. I don't know if that's the correct voice. We'll go with it, said Mr. Berry. She is very sorry for you, Miss Marjoribanks. It is sad for you to be left alone so young, and without a mother, and exposed to temptations which it is difficult to withstand at your age. Indeed, at all ages we have a great occasion to pray not to be led into temptation, for the heart of man is terribly deceitful. After hearing what she had to say, I thought it best to come up at once this morning and talk to Dr. Marjoribanks. I'm sure his natural good sense will teach him that you ought not to be left alone in the house. I do not see how papa can help it, said Lucilla. I'm sure it is very sad for him as well, but since dear mamma died, there has been nobody but me to be comfort to him. I think he begins to look a little cheerful now. Miss Marjoribanks continued with beautiful simplicity, looking her adversary in the face. Everybody knows that to be comfort to him is the object of my life. That is a very good feeling, said the rector, but it does not do to depend too much upon our feelings. You are too young to be placed in a position of such responsibility, and open to so much temptation. I was deeply grieved for Dr. Marjoribanks when his partner in life was taken from him. But my dear Miss Lucilla, now you have come home, who stands so much in need of a mother's care, we must try to find someone to fill her place. Lucilla uttered a scream of genuine alarm and dismay, and then she came to herself and saw the force of her position. She had it in her power to turn the tables on the rector, and she did not hesitate, as a weak woman might have done, out of consideration of anybody's feelings. Do you mean you have found someone for him to marry? She asked, with a look of artless surprise, bending her earnest gaze on Mr. Barry's face. As for the rector, he looked at Lucilla aghast, like a man caught in a trap. Of course not. Of course not, he stammered, after his first pause of consternation, and then he had to stop again to take breath. Lucilla kept up the air of amazement and consternation which had come naturally at the first, and had her eyes fixed on him, leaning forward with all the eager anxiety natural to the circumstances, and the unfortunate clergyman reddened from the edge of his white cravat to the roots of his grey hair. He was almost as sensitive to the idea of having proposed something improper as his sister could have been, though, indeed, at the worst there would have been nothing improper in it had Dr. Marjoribanks made up his mind to another wife. It is dreadful for me that am so young to go against you, said Lucilla. But if it is that, I cannot be expected to take any part in it. It would be not natural. It is a great object of my life to be a comfort to papa, but if that is what you mean, I could not give in to it. I'm sure Miss Bury would understand me, said Miss Marjoribanks, and she looked so nearly on the point of tears that the rector's anxious disclaimer found the words for itself. Nothing of the kind, my dear Miss Lucilla. Nothing of the kind, cried Mr. Bury. Such an idea never came into my mind. I cannot imagine how I could have said anything. I can't fancy what put such an idea. Miss Mortimer, you're not going away? Ursula had already seen with the corner of her eye that the victim had started violently and that her heavy veil had fallen over her face, but she had not taken any notice, for there are cases in which it is absolutely necessary to have a victim. By this time, however, the poor woman had risen in her nerves and undecided way. I had better. I don't know what voice to give her. There's so many people here. Oh, I had better go. I'm sure I had better go, she said hurriedly, clasping together a pair of helpless hands, as if they could find little strength in union. Miss Marjoribanks will understand you better, and you will perhaps understand Miss Marjoribanks. Ah, sit down, said Mr. Berry, who was not tolerant of feelings. Perhaps I expressed myself badly. What I meant to say was that Miss Mortimer, who has been a little unfortunate in circumstance, sit down, pray, had by singular providence just appreciated to me when my sister returned home yesterday. These things do not happen by chance, Lucilla. We're taken care of when we are not thinking of it. Miss Mortimer is a Christian lady for whom I have the greatest respect. A situation to take the oh, God, superintendence of the domestic affairs, and to have charge of you, would be just what would suit her. It must be a great anxiety to the doctor to leave you alone and without any control at your age. You must think the library is pleasant at first, but if you had a Christian friend to watch over and take care of you, what is the matter? Said the rector in great alarm. It was only the poor widow who was to have charge of Lucilla, according to his benevolent intention, looked so like fainting that Miss Marjoribanks jumped up from her chair and rang the bell hastily. It was not Lucilla's way to lose time about anything. She took the poor woman by the shoulders and all but lifted her to the sofa, where she was lying down with her bonnet off, when the rector came to his senses. To describe the feeling with which Mr. Berry contemplated this little entr'acte. That's the way I pronounce it. Entr'acte is a pause in a play, like a stop about halfway through, which was not in his program, would be beyond our powers. He went off humbly and opened the window when he was told to do so, and tried to find the eau de cologne on the table, while Thomas rushed downstairs for water at a pace very unlike his usual steady rate of progress. Oh, look, Thomas actually doing some kind of job. Wow. He hasn't felt so far with it, but I think he might in the future. Uh, Also, the eau de cologne is I suspect the reason they're asking for it is because if she's painting, it is good practice to put something strong smelling under her nose at the time to try and stop her from doing so, I suppose, and like wake her up a little. So there is that. In the way that you do smelling salts, I suppose. Although I've experienced that because one time I've experienced a similar thing, right? I won't go into details because we are reading a book. And honestly, they're not always that bad smelling, so there's that. Don't know. But yeah, to wake her up. As for Lucilla, she stood by the side of her patient, quite self-possessed, while the rector looked so foolish. She'll be all right directly, Miss Marjoribanks was saying. Lucky she never went right off. When you don't run right off, lying down is everything. If there had been any one to run and get some water, she would have got over it, but luckily I saw it in time. What possible answer Mr. Bury could make to this, or how he could go on with his address in the sight of the strange turn things had taken, it would have been hard to say. Fortunately, for the moment, he did not attempt it, but walked about it in dismay and put himself in the drought with his rheumatism, and felt dreadfully vexed and angry with Miss Mortimer, who, for her part, now she had done with fainting, manifested an inclination to cry, for which Mr. Bury in his heart could have whipped her, had that maid of discipline been permitted in the Church of England. Lucilla was merciful, but she could not help taking a little advantage of her victory. She gave her a suffering glass of water and eau de cologne to keep her from a relapse, and whispered to her a lie quiet. And then she came back and took her seat, and begged the rector not to stand in the drought. Draft? Not sure. I don't think she's strong, said Miss Marjoribanks confidently when she had wiled and disconcerted clergyman back to her side. Her color changes so she never would be able for what there is to be for what there is to do here, even if Papa would consent to think of it. For my part, I'm sure I should be glad of a little assistance, said Lucilla. But I never like to give false hopes, and I don't think Papa would consent. She looks nice if she was not so weak, poor thing, and there are such quantities of things to be done here. But if you wish it, Mr. Barry, I will speak to Papa, said Miss Marjoribanks, lifting her eyes, which were so open and straightforward, to the rector's face. To tell the truth, he did not in the least know what to say, and the chances are he would not have been half so vexed and angry, nor felt in so unchristian a disposition with the poor woman on the sofa, had he meant to do her harm instead of good. Yes, I should be glad if you would mention it to Dr. Marjoribanks, he said without very well knowing what he said, and got up to shake her hands with Lucilla, and then recollected that he could not leave his protégée behind him, and hesitated and did not know what to do. He was really grateful, without being aware of it, to Miss Marjoribanks when once again she came to his aid. "Please leave her a little," said Lucilla, "and I can make acquaintance with her, in case Papa should be disposed to think of it. She must lie still till it quite wears off. I would ask you to stay to lunch if I was not afraid of wasting your precious time." Mr. Barry gave a little gasp of indignation, but he did not say anything. On the whole, even though smarting under the indignity of being asked to lunch, as his sister has been, when probably there might be a repetition of the scene yesterday, he was glad to get safely out of the house, even at the risk of abandoning his enterprise. As for a woman in want of a situation who had so little common sense as to faint at such a critical moment, the rector was disposed to wash his hands off her, for Mr. Bury, like them all, like them all, as Lucilla said, was horribly frightened by a faint when he saw one, and afterwards pretended to disbelieve it, and called it one of the things which a little self-command could always prevent. When he was gone, Miss Marjoribanks felt the full importance of her victory, and then, though she had not hesitated to sacrifice this poor woman when it was necessary to have a victim, that moment was over, and she had no pleasure in being cruel. On the contrary, she went and sat by her patient and talked and was very kind to her, and after a while heard all her story, and was more comforting than Recta could have been for his life. "I knew it would hurt your feelings," Miss Marjoribanks Banks said candidly, "but I could not do anything else, and you know it was Mr. Bury's fault. But I am sure if I can be of any use to you—" It was thus that Lucilla added, without knowing it, another complication to her fortunes. But then, to be sure, clear-sighted as she was, she could not see into the future nor know what was to follow. She told the doctor in a very no, in the evening, with the greatest faithfulness, and described how Mr. Bury looked, and that she had said she did not think Papa would be disposed to think of it. Dr. Marjoribanks was so much entertained that he came upstairs to hear the end, and took a cup of tea. It was the third night in succession that the doctor had taken this step, though it was against his principles, and thus it will be seen that good come out of evil in a beautifully distinct and appropriate way. Now we're on chapter 9. It is at this point that I shall call it a day for now. Today is perhaps one of the more shortest streams, but there's still more artwork to be done for Art Fight, and as such, we shall be off until tomorrow. Tomorrow I will be having another drawing stream, and Wednesday is missing. So please look forward to that, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your evening. And come back for the next part of Miss Marjoribanks, starting from chapter 9. Have a good